If You Sleep in the Moonlight by J. Lisley Mitchell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Jones Gilardi. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. That was what he had been doing. God, what a dream. Suddenly awake, he found himself still sobbing, tense and high-strung, the blood pounding in his ears. Nightmare! This infernal moonlight! The rest of the room was in shadow, but across his face and pillow lay a beam of white radiance from the window, a wandering searchlight shaft out of the surrounding night and stillness. Warm and pringling, he brought his hands into the beams and covered his face with them. God, what a dream! He lay clutching his face. Remote across the mellow autumn night a dog bayed. The moonlight. A little wavelet of perfume drifted out of the darkness and lapped him. That bowl of Michaelmas daisies on the mantelshelf. He found the pressure of his fingers begin to relax involuntarily, his breath to come more easily. With a little laugh, he unblinded his eyes, so for a moment blinding them again in the moon radiance. He leant out of bed and groped in the blackness for the glass of ice water on his bedside table. Abruptly, its cold, smooth shape fitted into his fingers. He withdrew them with a gasp, lay petrified for a moment, then, again in the grip of nightmare remembrance, scrambled erect in a wild disorder of sheets. The sounds sifted to stillness across the room. That ice-cold touch. You fool, she's laying beside you. But he found he could not look. His left arm crept out across the pillows, and then withdrew against his will. Of course she's there, lying full stretched in that way she has, hand under her cheek, hair a dark blot in the moonlight, one shoulder bare. Fast asleep, you fool. Then listen for her breathing. He listened. The night and its silences came into the room, listening also, crowding round the bed. The sweat started out on his forehead. Silence. He broke it with a sudden groan which echoed throughout the room, and then abruptly was caught and extinguished by the waiting quietness. He flung aside the sheets, closed his eyes, and pantingly, a shadow wrestling outside the moonlight beam, groped and pounded on the place where she should have lain. The dull thwacks of his blows sounded to his own ears oddly muffled. Suddenly the watching shaft of moonlight vanished. At that he desisted and swung round in the disheveled bed, empty but for himself. Then he saw. The curtain was bellying and drifting across the window in a little waft of wind. Slowly it refurled and recoiled as he leant on his knuckles and watched it. The moonlight slipped into the room again. Below, in the darkness of the dining room, the clock struck 4. His frenzy had dropped from him. Dully, carefully, he got out of bed. The polished wood of the floor rose cold and radiant and faintly grainy to meet his feet. He stumbled to the window and put his head out into the moonlight and night air. Far across the sleeping town, the dog bayed again. No dream. He remembered it all now. Coolly, detachedly, he found himself remembering each detail. The house was utterly quiet. He looked round the room, looked down at his hands stealthily, then jerked them up, peered at them closely, smelt them. And a sudden test occurred to him. He lifted them up before his eyes, against the moonlight, to see if they trembled. But in the wavering sheen he could not be sure. Not even of the hand which had. It was with his left hand he had struck her, just below the chin, with the curved point of the old jackknife kept in the boot cupboard. He remembered now the undreamlike impact of the blow and her panting fall, and how surprised he had been that the blood had not gushed out, as he had always imagined it would. Often enough, in the mounting shame of the past few months, he had imagined that happening, but it had merely oozed a little red-rimmed patch, and his care in catching her as she fell and turning her over so that the kitchen linoleum might bear no stain of evidence had been needless. He had knelt and peered closely into her face, then noting the startled amaze of her eyes and the twitching of her mouth. After that, she had lain very still, and he had risen and gone to the sink and had drank some water. Standing now in the moonlight, he drank again, his hand steady, but as he lifted the glass he felt his arms ache. That was because of her weight in carrying her to the outhouse and laying her in the old tool chest. She had been surprisingly heavy, not that light weight his arms had known at other times, that first time of all in the hayfield by the sea. She laughed up at him then, with the sunlight on her face, and covered her lips as he bent to kiss them. And they'd struggled a little, absurdly, in the sunlight and sea sound, and a gull had come circling in from the hidden shore and swooped and caught beside them. She laughed at that, dropping her hand from her mouth, following the bird with her eyes while he kissed her unshielded lips. She'd left her lips unshielded to many since then. Why was the house so quiet? The curtain eddied towards him on another ghostly puff of wind. He put out his hand to steady it, and at that the moonlight ran nimbly up his arm. He stared at it, listening to the thumping of his own heart. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. Once she told him that idly, sleepily in his arms, when they looked out together at the full moon. He'd never imagined then there were other arms she could occupy with just such content. He'd gone all unknowing the facts for years, till men glanced at him and grinned, and women's looks were pitying, and hints of his humiliation multiplied and grew in volume. Lying beside her at nights, they had deafened him like the roar of that sea beside which he had first kissed her. Light of weight then, with her face a meeting pace of sun and laughter. Not like that white blotch in the darkness of the tool chest, a floating thing glimpsed a moment in the blackness as he'd closed the lid and tiptoed back to the kitchen. 2 hours ago, the clock had struck 2 as he'd come up the stairs alone. He started. A warm bead of perspiration had rolled from his scalp to his shoulder, yet his body was shivering with cold. He got into bed again. The clock below struck the half-hour, and at that, as if awaiting the signal, the moonlight veered suddenly from his pillow and did not return. He lay in the darkness, cold, yet feeling his throat beginning to perspire unaccountably. Tomorrow he would bury the body. Tomorrow. But what was happening to it out there, alone and cold in the blackness? Did it move? Somewhere he read that though the heart may cease to beat, the brain may not immediately die. Supposing that behind that cold, battered face there were still thoughts, cold, slow thoughts, with no power to impress their urgings on the surrounding body, with dead nerves which could no longer carry the messages to action. But what if they could? If, impelled by some overwhelming purpose, the dead body could set itself in motion, burst open the chest, come out. In the dimness he grinned to himself strainedly. That was how others had given themselves away. They had imagined just such impossible things in just such still and waiting hours, had imagined them until they had become real. They had thought of the blind, dead bodies slowly creeping from the tool chest, crossing the garden, unlatching the kitchen window, creeping through, opening with dead, cold purpose the kitchen door, which gave upon the passage. What was that? A creak, a far ghost draught of air. He had left the kitchen door unlatched, of course. It could not be the body, face blood oozing, sightless, coming along the passageway. Shuffle, shuffle, dead steps in the dark. Down at the foot of the stairs now, slowly, gropingly, turning to mount. He sprang out of bed with a thud, stamped his feet, and thereat the sound ceased. Or did they? The thing had turned. It had crossed to the sitting room. Crash! The door below slammed and shook. Desperation came upon him. He seized the electric torch from his bedside table, pulled open the bedroom door, and thudded downstairs. Towards where, in the blackness, he sensed was the foot of the stairs, he ceased to run and stood listening with a pounding heart. Thereon, with a winking, vanishing spear beam of moonlight, the sitting-room door slammed again. As it did so, something clammy chilled his face, and the clinkle of an overturned utensil came from the kitchen. He gave a croaking sob, reached the foot of the stairs in lurching bounds, and crossed the hall. Whimpering, he caught the handle of the sitting-room door. Always loose on its catch, flung it open, and flashed his electric torch within. Lying on the table, the first object focused in the shaft of light, lay a sheet of paper. He heard a sighing moan, which he realized came from himself. He stood staring at the scrap of paper, remembering it. Shaking, he bent to reread it. It was the note from his wife, which he had found awaiting him on his return home the previous evening. She had gone to the theater and would probably stay with a friend and not return home till morning. He had dreamt it all. Oh, God, a dream after all. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. An immense relief came on him, and with it a blinding, searing vision. This last nightmare hour of his, it might have been born of reality with no awakening, no letter of salvation to end it. had his angry seethings and plottings of the last evening found vent, for he had guessed the identity of the friend with whom she had gone to stay. Murder in his heart, he had ranged through the rooms, peering from the windows down the street, till exhaustion came upon him, and he must have dragged himself upstairs. A gurgling moan came from behind him. Torch in hand, he swung round confidently. Again in his face for a moment blew something cold. The damn kitchen door! With feet growing cold, he padded along the passage in the dead silence, through the kitchen, and there found that outer door had been verily left ajar. Hand on latch, he stopped and peered out into the moonlight. He did not remember having left the door open. How could he have done so? That was part of his dream. He smiled strainedly at the thought. Through the dim sheen bulked the outhouse. He made to close the kitchen door and then stopped. A nameless force swept him from the doorway, carried him down the garden path. He tore open the outhouse door, stumbled within, and flashed his torch upon the tool chest. And presently, through the still night and startling quiet folk from their beds, there rose scream upon scream of insane horror. If you sleep in the moonlight, you dream. End of If You Sleep in the Moonlight.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.